Good morning, everybody. Welcome as you're coming in. All right, I see our room is starting to populate. Thanks, everybody, for being here at 9 a.m., especially those of you who are here in Sacramento and may have had a late night. We appreciate it. We'll start in just a minute, so just enjoy Woody Guthrie for a moment, and we'll start soon. All right, I see have some people starting to say hello in the chat. Good morning to my colleague Kiki Poe. Hello. Hi, Jasmine. Thanks for your help. Awesome. Thanks, Jerry. This is the only logical song choice for this morning. Please just go ahead as you're coming in. Feel free to put your name and if you want your affiliation in the chat. And my icebreaker question for this morning is what is fueling you this morning? Maybe it's coffee, maybe it's tea, maybe it's early morning exercise, but what is fueling you this morning? For me, it was a run around the Capitol Park, a very short run, not much of a jogger. But what's fueling you this morning? Go ahead and put that in the chat if you want. Oh, hard to hear Gloria over the music. Can you hear me better now, Kiki? I'll also turn down the music a bit. Oh, great. Our captioner's here. Wonderful. So glad that we'll have captions this morning. And go ahead and put your name in the chat and then what's fueling you this morning. And I'm going to slowly fade out our music. And I'm going to ask our tech folks to work with our captioner to get that set up. That would be great. Great, another run this morning. All right, so we'll just give it like one more minute just for folks to come in, settle in. Welcome. We are going to get started in just a moment with our panelists, but since we're waiting for our room to fill up, please go ahead, put in the chat if you want your name, your affiliation. What is fueling you this morning? Perfect. Thanks, Jasmine. All right. Coffee, yes. I have a feeling it's going to be a very popular answer. Good morning, Janae. Good to see you here. Yes, I'm also a tea person. Yay, Megan. Melissa, thanks for being here. Okay, I'm actually going to take down my slide for a minute. Just want to make sure you all knew you were in the right room. I'm going to take down my slide a minute so that as we get started and introduce our panelists, you'll be able to see them. But as we're all coming in, just to warm up this morning, we're actually going to start with a quick poll just to see who's in the room, warm us all up, get us awake. Just to see who's here. So I believe Gavin is going to launch a poll for you. What kind of organization are you working with? Go ahead and check who you're with today. Watching that fill up. Wait for a few more answers. Okay, great. Gavin, do you want to go ahead and close that or should I do? Okay, perfect. And then you, all right. Oops. And are the results up there? Great. So we have a lot of local and state government people today, which is great. Really glad to have you, and affordable housing providers. So we kind of have both sides of that and a good number of advocates. Perfect. All right. Thanks for that. Oh, and we have a few other folks too. Great. Welcome. And can we go to our next poll, please? Our next poll question. Okay, so what it says up on the screen is, what is your experience with public land and housing? And you should be able to see this, but I'll just go ahead and read out the answers because they're kind of long. I realize they're cutting off on the screen. So have you been a part of a campaign advocating for affordable homes on public land? Have you been part of a government organization making decisions about public land? Have you developed homes on public land? You've heard of campaigns for public land, but you've never been part of an advocacy campaign, or this is totally new to you and you're excited to learn more. We'll give you just a couple more seconds on that. Okay. Go ahead and close that. Great. And share the results. All over the place. I love that. Not too many people who have actually built or developed on public land. So that's interesting. And hopefully we'll be able to increase that number with some of the learnings we have today. But people have worked on this before, or some folks, it's really new to them. So it's a good spread. That's perfect. Okay. And then I think we have one last poll question, if you can get that up. What aspects of using public land for public good feel most daunting for you or for your work? Navigating the legal process, timeline of advocacy, process of deciding how the land will be used, persuading elected officials, financing the project, something else entirely, or I don't know, I'm still learning, but I'm sure there's a lot. Right, we're almost up to 75% participation. Okay, let's go ahead and close this one. All right, all over. And this one you could choose multiple things. So I have a feeling it's like all of these things are challenges, in particular, persuading elected officials and financing the project. And we've certainly heard that before. So just to give our panelists a sense of what people are going to want to hear from them. Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Gavin. We can take down those polls. And I'll just get into it by starting to introduce our panelists this morning. We shared those results. Okay. Great. Okay. So our panelists this morning, I'm going to start just in order of their last names. We have Jeffrey Buchanan. I'm not going to be giving their whole bios. They're in your Whova app, but just to give you a taste, Jeffrey is with Working Partnerships USA. He's been there a number of years, where he heads up policy and research efforts. He has a really fascinating resume, having worked for Oxfam, working on environmental issues, workforce development, and so much more. And we are so glad to have him here this morning. And Jeffrey, what is fueling you this morning?
Yeah, this morning, coffee in a fun little watercolor mug with a llama on it. But I'm a big coffee person, turned into a bit of a coffee snob. So, but
awesome.
Glad to be here.
You're in good company, I think. Probably a lot of coffee snobs around here. Okay, and then going next to Shea Hossain, who is an attorney with Brenny Public Law Group. She brings her legal analysis to bear, working with nonprofits and government and community groups. And we are so glad to have worked with her in the past and have her bring her expertise. And she's going to be talking to you today about the Surplus Land Act, which you really need to know about if you wanted to build on a lot of these lands. Shea, what is fueling you this morning?
So I'm fasting today for Ramadan. So I had water and tea at 5:30, before 5:30 a.m.
Right. Ramadan Mubarak, and you were up way earlier than I was.
I will take a nap. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent choice. And Chris Iglesias, last but not least, of course, he is the Chief Executive Officer of the Unity Council, which for 53 years has been providing everything from healthcare to community development to housing in the largest Latino Latinx neighborhood in the Bay Area, the Fruitvale in Oakland. Their Dia de los Muertos festival is legendary. Chris has a ton of public-private partnership experience, which we'll talk about today. And Chris, what is fueling you this morning?
Well, good morning, Gloria. Thank you. So water, you can't see it. I'm kind of showing it, but it's anyway.
It's disappearing.
Yeah, it's disappearing. But I'm in the office, and so I was here early, and I was looking for coffee, but we haven't made it yet. And we get the coffee from Red Bay down the street. So, but apparently it's coming. So I didn't want to make it because I would have destroyed it. So right now, it's
right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here even before your Red Bay coffee has arrived. We appreciate it. Okay, so I'm just going to I'm going to start before our panelists get into it. I'm going to just show a couple of pictures and let you all know what we're actually going to be covering today with these three folks who are really approaching this from different angles. Come on, slide, please advance. We just introduced you to these folks, so please take note of them and look us up later if you want to. And we're going to be answering three main questions. Why does public land matter? What are we doing about it? And how can you get involved? And I just wanted to say a word or two because this is really important for EBHO about why public land matters and why building on city-owned land or transit-owned land can be so transformative. And we want to do more of it and help to get rid of some of those barriers that we were talking about earlier. A lot of our work recently got inspired by, I'm not going to talk about this project because it's very controversial, but I just wanted to point out that in downtown Oakland near Lake Merritt, which is generally considered the gem of the city or the heart of the city, there is a parcel that was formed essentially by public action. It was a piece of land that's in pink here that you really couldn't develop on until the city actually used public funds to realign a road and realign a bridge. And it opened up this amazing site right next to the lake. And it became the site of a lot of controversy because initially a market rate high rise was proposed there. And long story short, it essentially sparked a movement with people saying, you know, this is a prime site, it's publicly owned by the city. This shouldn't just be market rate housing. And whatever you think of everything that ensued, I think it's fairly undeniable that because of community organizing around the rallying cry of public land for public good, whatever eventually gets developed on that site, there's going to be some degree of affordable housing there, most likely mixed income, but there's also a push for 100% affordable. So what was going to be a market rate high rise, fortunately, is now mostly vacant except for some transitional housing, but there will be affordable housing there because of advocacy. And advocacy really does matter. We've seen it, for example, with BART. I have to give a shout out to EBHO's policy director, Jeff Levin, and to some of our partners like NPH and the Public Interest Law Project, who among others and BART set a goal of having 35% affordable housing developed on BART lands. And this is the building with inclusionary housing that I passed on my way to the BART before I took the train up here to Sacramento. You can't see, this doesn't look like transit-oriented development. There is a BART station under the freeway. You can't see it. But advocacy matters because BART is building more affordable housing and inclusionary housing on its land. And Chris is going to talk about that shortly. It also matters because public land, there are all these uses like former military bases that offer vast opportunities for transformative development, like this decommissioned naval base in the city of Concord in Contra Costa County. And we've been working for many years to take it from something like this weird moonscape on the left to something like what you see on the right, even though this is no longer the developer for the project. And we and our coalition partners were able over 10 years ago to win a commitment from the city because we could pressure the city. They were the ones who had to decide the fate of the land because it's currently owned by the Navy, but it will be owned by the city. We were able to win a commitment to 25% affordable housing, union jobs, a new regional park, and much more. It hasn't happened yet, but we've got those commitments down and we're pushing hard. And we're taking those learnings, and there are a lot of groups in Oakland who are really organizing around the concept, the A's ball team, who are taking something that looks like what's on the left, an active port, and turning it into this sort of dreamscape ballpark with a couple of cranes left, I think, for decorative effect on the right. And again, whatever you think of this transformation, we want to make sure that because this is publicly owned land, that it brings benefits back to the community in the form of deeply affordable housing, in the form of displacement, anti-displacement measures, quality jobs, green building, solid sustainable transportation, community engagement, and so much more. So these are just a couple of the things that we're working on and that we have tried to win. And now you're going to hear a little bit more from our panelists about how they're actually making this happen. So I'm going to stop my share. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to my folks about, okay, so why does this actually matter? I talked about it a little bit, but you all can get into it a bit more. I'm going to start with Jeffrey just for a couple minutes. Why does this work matter?
Yeah, I think for our organization, so Working Partnerships for folks who might be unfamiliar with us, we're a mix of a community organizing group and a policy advocacy think tank, really forged in the labor movement in Santa Clara County. And I think for us, when we think about public lands, we start with our core values, believing that housing is a human right, and that every worker deserves a family supporting job and a voice at work. And so, given where we are in our housing crisis, we really need to think about some core issues when it comes to capital, land, and political power. And public land is really central, I think, to solving both our, when it comes to our jobs issues and our housing issues. Local governments have underutilized land, and really we need to ensure that we get the greatest community benefits about how that land is utilized. And here in Santa Clara County, we've been working to ensure public land is used for public good for a number of years. Silicon Valley has some of the most expensive dirt in the country. And so when it comes to thinking about these limited resources, we need to use them well, because let's get real, most of our land is already zoned for single family homes. And so when public land becomes available, thinking about what's possible in terms of jobs, in terms of large scale affordable housing is really essential in how we think about stewarding that public land. We for years now, going back to redevelopment days, have been fighting for community benefits with public land deals. More recently had worked with our Valley Transportation Authority on developing some really strong affordable housing and good job standards. And we'll talk in a minute about some work more recently in the city of San Jose around community benefits and one of our largest public land deals around downtown West in downtown San Jose with Google.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeffrey. It's a great summary. And I love how you end that with a cliffhanger. That's perfect. So let me take this over to Shea. Why does this work matter?
We can think about how it matters by first imagining a world without public land. Would you have to hope that the person who owns the sidewalk in your neighborhood allows you to walk on it for free? Or that the company that owns the park across the street allows you to host a birthday picnic there? Or that the family who owns the land next to your office will build affordable housing on it? It's hard to imagine those scenarios, but thinking through them might help us appreciate public land and not take them for granted. Public lands have been a key component of our society for a very long time. Public agencies have been entrusted to use our taxpayer dollars to make them available for the public's needs, like recreation, services, and transportation. So in our growing housing affordability crisis, public lands can again be part of that solution. They are a golden opportunity to meet public needs in a way that the private market has been unable. And what does it mean to use the public land for the public good? It's when local agencies use their land in a manner that ensures everyone is good, that everyone has a good and stable home in a good and well-resourced neighborhood with a good and fulfilling job, et cetera. But how local agencies can and should do this is the more challenging question, and we're each going to talk about that today.
So well said. I love that vision of a world with no public land, which would be kind of terrifying. Actually, this is why we just need to, in a world of increasing privatization and fragmentation of everything, let's keep going for the common good and the commons. I love it. Chris, how about you? Oh, you're getting lots of love in the chat, should you be? Why does this work matter, Chris?
Well, thanks, Gloria. And so, first of all, those questions that you asked at the beginning were really helpful to see who's here. So I took screenshots of all of them, and I'm just kind of looking at them. So first, I'll start by saying that I was in the public sector for 23 years prior to coming to the Unity Council. City of Oakland, BART for a year, and then 20 years in San Francisco. And during that time, I was 12 years at redevelopment in San Francisco, and we're doing all kinds of developments, especially after the earthquake in '89, which opened up a lot of public land, especially where all the freeways were, right? So like you go to San Francisco, Octavia Boulevard, coming off Fell Street, a lot of people probably don't even remember that freeway that just tore through the Western Addition, behind Van Ness, right? That basically let you off right there on Franklin. All that was gone, and all that public land became available. So I've seen, the real benefit of being able to utilize wonderfully placed public land. Now, it's not easy, right? And now I'm going to probably focus more around public land around BART stations. And I think, they're not easy developments, they're not easy to do. The fact that BART has committed 35% to affordable housing is a big deal. We're doing 100% right now on our sites, which BART really didn't support, right? They wanted more market rate stuff, right? So I think that's a challenge. But I think the more fundamental question around the public land, especially when you're dealing with public entities, is that how did they get the land, right? You know, I mean, a lot of the BART projects, that was all eminent domain back in the 50s or whatever, right? To make these BART stations, to put these tracks in, all along through mostly like a lot of low income neighborhoods or wherever, and they use that power of eminent domain. And now we have to go back and fight for that land again. Now it's a little crazy when you think about it sometimes, right? So I think one, we are in position to fight for that land. And I think now, as we come out of the pandemic, this land is even more vital, right? Especially for our essential workers. And how do we make sure? I think people have realized, oh my God, we can't have our essential workers living in the Central Valley and trying to commute into the Bay Area. We need our essential workers to have good, affordable housing. And that's why I think I'm so excited about this conversation, because it's a really unique opportunity for all of us to meet the moment right now. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Chris, for bringing us back to that historical perspective of, how did these public entities acquire this land in the first place? And of course, we have to go back even further than that, right? And recognize that we are all on unceded territory of Indigenous peoples. I'm on territory of Miwok and other Indigenous peoples here in Sacramento. We do our work on Ohlone land in the Oakland area. And so we have to acknowledge that this concept of the land belonging to someone, some institution, is in itself extremely flawed and has caused a lot of harm. And so let's try to mitigate some of that harm by making sure that the benefits to the general public are as broad as possible. Thanks for reminding us of that. And I'm going to go into our next question now, but I just want to remind folks that the Q&A is open to you. Please do use the Q&A rather than the chat for your questions. Feel free to keep up the commentary and the love for our panelists in the chat. That's great. But if you have a specific question you want us to answer, please do use the Q&A box for that, because that's how we'll track it and make sure that we're answering everything. I did see yesterday that there was a question posed for us in the Whova app, which I couldn't figure out how to answer through Whova. But thank you, Jasmine, for reminding us. We're not actually going to address this question very much, but I do want to mention it because this person took the time to post it yesterday. They're asking, will the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act be referenced in this session, which is a major federal law that governs all sorts of things around assisting people who are unhoused, from military-based reuse to provisions in schools. We are, to my knowledge, we are not actually going to discuss that very deeply today. I will just say, though, that the project that I mentioned in passing earlier, the Concord Naval Weapons Station, because that is a federal military base that has been decommissioned, there are McKinney-Vento provisions that apply to that under base reuse law. And so there is a requirement that some of the housing developed on that base be an accommodation for people who are formerly unhoused. And so there will be homeless units built as part of that development, and that's because of federal law. So that's another reason why these public laws and public statutes are so important in us moving forward. But I don't believe we're going to discuss that further, but just noting the panelists that we did have a question on McKinney-Vento. And we have another sort of technical one in the chat that maybe later we can get to. I don't know if Shujiti is able to answer that one. But for now, let's go ahead back to letting our panelists have a little bit longer to talk about what they and their organizations have actually done, or what they can teach us today about how to develop on public land and how to have a community have voice on public land. So I'm going to start this time with Shujiti, because she's going to provide us sort of a technical and legal framework that is really important, especially for housing developers, for everybody, but especially for housing developers to know about, to make sure that your local jurisdiction is following the proper steps that they need to when they have a piece of land that they are going to lease or sell. So Shujiti, do you want to talk about this Surplus Land Act for a bit?
Yes, and I will share my screen. All right. Yes, so the Surplus Land Act is a state law, and it is one of the tools that local agencies, affordable housing developers, and advocates can use to help get affordable housing onto public land. In a nutshell, it requires local agencies, before they negotiate with developers broadly, to sell or lease their land, they first have to notify and negotiate with affordable housing developers. But what is surplus land under the Act? It has to be land that's owned by a local agency that's defined as city, county, district, JPA, successor agency to former redevelopment agency, and more. So it's pretty broad. And then it has to be not necessary for the local agency's use. Agency use can't mean commercial or industrial activity, or even selling or leasing that land for investment or revenue. Before the current version of the Surplus Land Act, which was amended in 2020, in 2020, this definition or this explanation of agency use was added to clarify that a local agency cannot say that they're selling or leasing their land for investment or revenue, and therefore it is necessary for the agency's use, because then that would take out basically any sale or lease from the Surplus Land Act. So now it's very clear that the agency cannot simply say we're using it to raise revenue, but it has to acknowledge that it's actually not using it for the local agency's use anymore. And then the local agency needs to take formal action to declare it as surplus or exempt surplus. The Surplus Land Act lists several unique examples of, or categories of when land is exempt surplus. Most of them usually don't apply, but just some that I'll highlight that may be most relevant for you all are that the land is exempt from the Surplus Land Act when the local agency is releasing the RFP, or the request for proposals, for 100% affordable with at least 75% going to lower income households, or mixed use developments where the land is more than an acre, at least 300 housing units are proposed, and at least 25% of them are affordable to lower income. Now this, I'll be giving a really basic overview of required steps and share some more detailed resources at the end. But basically what the local agency needs to do before negotiating with other developers are to first send a notice of availability to interested developers and to the California Department of Housing and Community Development, saying that that local agency has land available for sale or lease, and that they're seeking proposals for at least 25% affordable housing, affordable to lower income households. And so HCD, the department, now posts a list of those notices of availability that come in, and the list of developers, community land trusts, et cetera, who have expressed interest in receiving those notices. So those are all online, and I'll share a link to that later as well. Local agencies have to wait 60 days to receive proposals from those interested developers, and then negotiate with any who respond with proposals of at least 25% lower income. If multiple respond, the agency can negotiate with them concurrently, and but it does have to give priority to the proposals with the most number of affordable units or the deepest affordability level. They need to negotiate for at least 90 days and then report that process to HCD for review. And that's also a new requirement as of 2020. Generally, those amendments in 2020, which were enacted by AB 1486, have given HCD a stronger role in oversight, which has helped really local agencies, developers, advocates all have more clarity around what is actually required and what is what is a valid process under the Surplus Land Act. Even if the local agency doesn't reach a deal for at least 25% affordable development from the proposals it received, or if no proposals came in, there's still a requirement that at least 15% of any housing, as long as there are 10 or more units built there, must be affordable to lower income households. A lot of times, it sounds like a lot of people here have not gone through the process of the Surplus Land Act, and it seems like so far a lot of times, affordable agencies maybe aren't able to afford like large, purchasing large swaths of land that are large parcels that that an agency is selling, and so they often can't reach an agreement. And maybe there are ways that we can all think creatively together, like for example, asking the local agencies to think about kind of selling parcels maybe making the parcels smaller, making them easier to sell discreetly to an affordable housing developer, or other ways. But when it's hard to reach an agreement and eventually agreement isn't reached, at least there is this baseline affordability. I haven't added that yet. There's a baseline affordability level that is really key, and especially for those larger development areas. Like if if thousands of housing units are going to be built, and having at least 15% of those affordable, that's still a really still a good outcome. Enforcement mechanisms that I think are important for everyone to know about also are first a penalty, which went into effect in 2020. And that's where the Department of Housing and Community Development will fine the local agency at 30% of the sale price if the sale or lease goes through, if they're enforcing it after the deal went through already. And then 50% for any subsequent violations by that agency. The Attorney General can also take action to enforce the Surplus Land Act. We haven't seen this happen yet, as far as I know, or at least if it's happened, it hasn't happened very much. So that one is a little less clear on how or when that could happen. But lawsuits have been happening for a long time. Affected parties can sue local agencies to make sure they're complying. Another helpful thing that I think will be useful to all of you is that the SLA now requires cities and counties to create an inventory of their surplus land in urban areas by December 31st of each year. So if you're an advocate and you're not seeing that available, then talk to your city or county to see if you can access it. And then if you are with a local government, try to make sure that this inventory is kept up to date. And another helpful resource is that the state is required to include those inventories in its own inventory of state-owned surplus land. More resources that I'll post in the chat are a flow chart that walks you through different scenarios that could happen under the Surplus Land Act, frequently asked questions with more detail, and then HCD's guidelines with more detail. And I'll stop there.
So much. That was a really great overview, and hopefully people found that helpful. And those resources are also going to end up in the chat. There is actually, there is a question in the Q&A. There's several, but there's a question from Eric with City Heights CDC, who says that while the Surplus Land Act affords affordable housing developers an opportunity to bid on public land, it does not dictate price. Very true. We are competing with market rate and for-profit developers. Is there any consideration for mandating that public land being sold or leased to an affordable housing developer be discounted a minimum percentage from market value? My understanding is that the SLA does not require that. Can you speak to that just for a moment?
That's right, Gloria. Yeah, the SLA does not require that discount. It actually grants the agency the right to still get a fair market value return, or a fair return on their on that deal. So that is a tricky issue, and so that's kind of what I was saying about maybe us having to think of creative ways for local agencies and affordable housing developers to figure out other ways to make it more manageable and more practicable. So sometimes that is, if the agency is trying to sell like 5 parcels at once, and it's easier for the affordable housing developer to purchase 1 parcel, then working with that agency to asking them to separate out their requests for proposals on those parcels.
Thank you for that. It's one that was relevant, so I wanted to make sure we got to that. And we'll circle back. There's a lot of good questions coming into Q&A. We will come back to those later as well. And if any of our panelists also want to type answers to the Q&A when they're not speaking, we can also do that, but we'll make sure that we keep an eye on these. Thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to go now to, well, what actually happens when you have BART land and you spend a couple decades figuring out how to build on it. So I'm going to have Chris now talk about his work and Unity Council's work in Fruitvale.
Oh, thanks, Gloria. Yeah, there's some really good questions in that Q&A. And of course, like Craig Edelman puts the toughest one in there, so I'll let somebody else answer that one. But
Chris, I was hoping you were going to answer Craig's question.
yeah, and now I was looking at it, I was like, oh my God.
Man, okay, someone's going to have to answer Craig's question.
Yeah,
Don't worry, Craig, we'll get to you.
Yeah, we'll do a little more research on that one. But yeah, I think, what, see, what your organization is doing to advance this. So, we've been in this space for many, many years, and I'll focus more on the Fruitvale Transit Village and just kind of how that evolved. And everything I'm about to say is documented, so I'm not just like, taking shots at BART or anything like that. Plus, I used to work for BART, so I feel like I have a little bit of room where I can kind of take, gentle shots. But we are big time partners with BART, but it didn't start that way. I think back in the 80s and 90s, BART envisioned building a massive parking garage where the existing Fruitvale Transit Village sits today. And their reasoning, documented, was that they wanted to be able to insulate or protect their commuters from the Fruitvale community, right? That was the whole intention of putting that BART parking lot where they initially wanted to put it. And I think the Unity Council, who was already there, and La Clinica and Centro and a lot of other organizations fought it, right? So it was all advocacy that really started those conversations. And I mean, from the ground up advocacy. And I think that shouldn't be lost, because I still think you need that type of power to move developments on public land wherever, right? You're seeing it in Concord, you're seeing it around with Caltrans, you're seeing a lot of these opportunities. Advocacy is key. And I think the Unity Council, with a lot of other organizations, basically fought BART on their plans to develop this, parking garage. And so I think BART finally said, okay, fine. What do you guys want to do? What do you guys think should go here? And they said, well, we think it should be something more for the community. And that's when the whole concept of a transit village came up. Now, that was back in the 90s, where, now it's 2022. And some of the things that were envisioned back then, we are just finishing now. So this takes a long time. So just because advocacy gets you started doesn't mean that that's going to be the final, right? Even what we're building right now, and we're finally building what we call phase 2 of the existing transit village. And technically, when you look at all the documents and the plans, the original plans, this was supposed to be finished in 2008. The Fruitvale Village was finished in 2004. And it was envisioned that we would start building almost immediately on the second site, which is another complicated deal. All these deals are very complicated. Like Shatushi could mention, right? You need the best lawyers, you need the best advocates, you need all kinds of stuff, but they take a long time to put together. And the fact that, we are basically finishing what was envisioned back in the 90s right now, it just gives you an idea how long some of these projects can take. Do they all have to take this long? No. I think that, you had the economy, tank, and all the issues around 2007, 2008. I think that kind of set things back. But, the fact that, we're finally here now, it's exciting, but it's just a reality check on the complexity of these developments and how to move them forward. So yeah, so I think we've always played a dual role. Big time advocates for the community, which we continue to do, especially now with COVID. A lot of it's not around, maybe it's not around housing, it's around health issues. It is around health. It is also around housing too, financial issues, getting folks back working again. But advocacy plays a huge part of all of this. And Gavin, I don't know if you have those photos, and maybe you could just throw one up so I could kind of show everybody what's happening today out there. So this is from last night. I'm actually up on the BART platform. I'm looking down at what we call this is Casa Sueños, or phase 2B. This is the final phase of the transit village. We are pouring this morning. We're pouring today and tomorrow. So this is the top of the parking garage, and then we'll start building up above that. To the right of that building is Casa Arabella, named after Arabella Martinez, who was advocating back in the day for the existing transit village. But this is 30 years in the making, right? And so many people have just pushed to get us to this point. So advocacy, partnering, having good, strong partnerships with BART, with the city of Oakland, with the state, all kinds of complicated funding with the county. Obviously, the county has been a great partner. it really is advocacy and partnerships with your public sector partners to build on public land to make this happen. So yeah, this is from last night. There's probably I don't know how many workers up there right now pouring all the concrete. It's really exciting, but I just, it's just a reality check that to move these projects along, it's really a strong combination of working with the EBHOs and other groups and to mobilize to keep this real. The other thing that I just want to say is that the one that's we're pouring right now, this was supposed to be all market rate, almost 200 units of market rate housing. And then the affordable is Casa Arbella right there. And it was very challenging to get BART to get on board that this is going to be an affordable development. And I think, but part of it, they're listening to their directors that, the economic pressures of building more affordable housing was key. And that is the existing transit village right there. So you can see how close they are together. But again, advocacy and strong partnerships with your public entities, whether it be BART, the city, the state, the county, I think those are all key. Pause. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, one of EBHO's former board members, Natalie Bonawit, has worked for many, many years on Treasure Island, the island that's in between, part of San Francisco technically, but in between San Francisco and the East Bay. And she always talks about how it took 20 years from the start of that massive redevelopment project to the first building breaking ground, 20 years. And Chris outlined some of those challenges. So it's like, what can we all do collectively to make sure that it's not taking us a couple of decades to bring this housing and these other benefits to these very complex sites. So thanks for outlining some of that. And there are all sorts of questions piling up for you all in the Q&A. Regina wants to hear about your costs and sources, Chris. So just a heads up that that's in the Q&A there. But before we get to more of the questions, and I see that Shajuti is answering some of them, which is great. Jeffrey, let's go to you and let's broaden it out to what happens when a coalition is at the start of this long process. Tell us a little bit about what you all have done in San Jose.
Yep, thanks, Gloria. Yeah, so I want to bring it back just to my initial statement that when we think about the solutions to the housing crisis, it's really a problem of capital. And I included that what happens between workers and employers in terms of wages, land and political power, capital, land, and political power. And, with our organization, one of our, I think, most successful coalitions in recent years, Silicon Valley Rising, came together really after the last recession, thinking about, seeing some of the wealthiest corporations on earth, still be, building and growing and people becoming more successful at a time when you had folks who were working in cafeterias on these companies living in garages, or folks who were driving the Google bus or working as a security officer on a tech campus who were sleeping in their cars. And so what do we need to do to bring labor and community organizations together to try to build a Silicon Valley economy that worked for everybody? And we found, we've actually been able to organize close to 10,000 workers into unions in the tech economy. But even as we were able to organize those workers and win contracts for increasing wages, that housing costs were still outstripping even those gains that we're seeing at the bargaining table. And so with that, have really focused on bringing our labor partners, folks like here, SEIU, the Teamsters, our local South Bay Labor Council, together with community organizations working on housing justice. So folks like Latinos United for a New America, the Affordable Housing Network, Somos Mayfair Pact, our local Law Foundation of Silicon Valley. And back in 2017, we saw really a kind of a surprise announcement. San Jose, one of our biggest kind of parcels of public land, centers on around Dearden Station, which is set to see about $10 billion in transportation infrastructure join up, bringing high-speed rail, the BART extension down into downtown San Jose, some existing improvements to existing transportation systems, really major public investment coming together around some public land that at one point was supposed to be where we would lure the A's to come down to San Jose and build a ballpark. after Major League Baseball said no to that, it was a big question mark what was going to happen. And so back in 2017, Google and the city announced that they had cut a deal that they were going to negotiate for the development of a big tech campus in the middle of downtown San Jose. This came as quite a shock to the community, and particularly to the labor community and our housing justice allies, knowing where we were in the housing crisis, to hear about a big development like this that at first, had no discussion of including housing, and came at the middle of a time when the city of San Jose was fighting whether or not it actually had to follow the Surplus Lands Act. And so, we had huge questions on what this was going to mean for displacement. We hosted a series of town halls. We're out on the doors, knocking, trying to understand what the community thought about this project, engaged with thousands of residents in the city. And what we heard was kind of a little surprising, that people didn't want to say no to Google coming to San Jose, but they wanted Google to be responsible and to really, if they were going to come and build this thing on public land, they wanted to see Google address its impacts, and really to make sure that the voice of those who were impacted was at the table. They wanted to see big investments in addressing displacement, good jobs, good union jobs. They wanted to see investments in education and training. This is one of the things that was most surprising for me. Even though, like, talking to parents, and I'm a school board member, so this is kind of, even when I talk to parents myself, my neighborhood's pretty close to this development. They recognize the kind of occupational segregation in companies like Google and the tech industry, but there's still this glimmer of hope that they want their kids to get one of those jobs so they can continue to stay in San Jose. And so all that together with this kind of, hey, we want to see addressing displacement, we want to see good union jobs when possible, or, the kind of educational opportunities to get our kids into these jobs. And they wanted the community to have a voice in how these issues played out, not just to have Google make the decisions or the city of San Jose make the decisions, but the community make the decision. And so with that, those set of priorities in mind, we've really set out to organize, and which was a pretty big challenge, because at first, essentially Google told us to go pound dirt, and the city was not very keen on allowing community benefits. And so it took a lot, thousands of emails, marches, protests, a lawsuit. We, for the first time, our organization sued the city of San Jose for some secrecy involved with the deal, participation in public meetings, and we also got involved for the first time in some corporate campaigning around shareholder actions. We had our first shareholder resolution that we sponsored, and went to a series of annual shareholder meetings, which is an interesting story I kind of want to tell. It's just a great story when you think about community organizing, of a breakthrough at one of those meetings. So Yolanda Chavez is a public leader with the organization Latinos United for a New America. She's a mother, has been in San Jose for 16 years, immigrated from Mexico, raising her kids in the city. She loves the fact that, like, her teachers know her kids well. They know their love of baseball. She has neighbors that are going to look after her and her kids. And, she's seen a bunch of people of her friends and family move out to the Central Valley, and she didn't want to see that happen to her when Google and some of the new development coming to the city would move in. So she wrote a letter to Sundar Pichai, the Google CEO, and just really called out she wanted to see Google be a partner to work with the community to address displacement as they're coming to the city. And she was concerned that she wasn't seeing that kind of commitment to date from the company. And, we got her a proxy vote to be able to get into the shareholder meeting. She went, she addressed the board. And, when she was at the event, she got into the breakfast line. I think she was going to grab a piece of toast. And a man approached her. She said, when she was telling it to me and one of our organizers, she's like, yeah, it was a tall Indian man, I think his name was Sundar. And it turned out that Sundar Pichai had actually came and talked to her, made a commitment to, that they were going to try to make things right when it came to affordable housing. And, after that, we saw really a shift in how the company was willing to work with us in our coalition. There were still challenges, but we were able to get to a negotiating table to be able to work on things like getting agreements, or at least getting support where we saw, 2,300 cafeteria workers in Google organize and get a union in terms of their existing workers. We were able to develop a community benefits agreement where, not only do we see major investments in affordable housing in the deal, I think it's close to, through land dedication, the commercial linkage fee that's being paid, the inclusionary housing, it's close to over 1,500 affordable homes in the project. But then also the creation of what I believe is the largest community benefits fund of its kind. Since there was no tax benefits or anything in the deal, Google was committing to more than $150 million in a community fund that would actually be governed by the community. So the city isn't going to have the final say on grant making. It'll be a community advisory body that's selected, that has like specific carve outs for people with lived experience. Folks like Yolanda that can serve on that body to address, the issues of displacement, of creating good jobs and kind of workforce opportunities for communities that are impacted by displacement, and not just for the area around the project itself, but really for the entirety of San Jose and neighborhoods that are facing displacement. So the coalition was really able, I guess in a nutshell, coalition was able to come together to organize, to be able to have a say in what community benefits look like, and really ensuring, even though, at first the things like the Surplus Lands Act weren't at the center of how this deal played out, but through political organizing, community organizing, we're really able to get at ensuring pathways where the community would have control over how community benefits played out and focus on those community priorities, good jobs and affordable housing. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And Susie Dershowitz in the chat says, amazing advocacy. Thanks for sharing your work on the CBA or community benefits agreement. And I couldn't agree more. It's really phenomenal work that coalition has pulled off. And I love the story about this Sundar just coming in and coming up and chatting with your leader.
Yes, Yolanda's a badass. So that's all I can say.
She sounds like it. If only we had more folks like that actually running these tech companies. But thanks for sharing that. And Kiki says, thank you for sharing that story. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to mix up facilitator's privilege. I'm going to mix up my run of show for my panelists just a little bit. We are going to come back to that third question of what can people do? How can they take action? But I want us to, because we have a lot of good meaty questions piling up in the Q&A, I want to see if we can address any of those, and then we'll come back to sort of how folks can get involved and take action. So Shajuti, we actually have several on the Surplus Land Act, and I wanted to see if any of these, I see you answered one in the chat, sorry, in the Q&A, thank you. There's a couple of others. One is that Jerry says, it's my understanding that jurisdictions that sell occupied residential property as surplus property for development are required to comply with California relocation law. Can this requirement be used to negotiate a tenant purchase? Is this something that you can answer?
I haven't heard about this situation, so I can't answer that. But
no problem.
I think it's a great question.
No problem. And if folks who are attending, we have 86 people this morning, which I am blown away. So thank you so much for coming. If you have answers to one of these and our amazing expert panelists don't have it, and you do, feel free to throw that in the chat. I know Jeff Levin, my colleague, knows, I know he knows the answers to some of these. So he'll probably, I see he's already answered one in the Q&A.
I think he knows them. I think Jeff knows most of these answered for sure.
We'll see. If we have to promote him to panelists, we'll do that. So another question was about whether there is CEQA streamlining involved with the SLA. Shajuti's answered that, saying not in the Surplus Land Act itself, but can't speak to whether CEQA directly interacts with developments proceeding under the Surplus Land Act. But then Jeff Levin responded that 100% affordable projects might qualify for CEQA streamlining and exemption using SB 35. So it's kind of like fitting together the puzzle pieces of these different pieces of legislation. So not a direct CEQA reference through SLA, but SB 35 that's a bill that was passed several years ago, which is another way to get CEQA streamlining on 100% affordable. And oh, great, and Jeffrey's also typing an answer there. Can the panelists talk about any legislation that's being proposed to strengthen the SLA?
That's another Jeff question.
That's a Jeff.
You
That's a
worked
Jeff
on the
question.
last legislation.
Actually, because that was asked, Gavin, is it possible to allow Jeff Levin to come off mute just for a second to answer a question? Because that is actually a live conversation.
Maybe we can try to make him a
Oh, he's there.
co-host.
He's,
Oh,
did we
cool.
just promote him to panelist? Okay, Jeff, you have your, sorry, I just like threw you into it, but I see you're active here. Do you want to talk for just a quick second about what you and others are working on SLA update legislation?
Sure, and I apologize, I don't have a functioning camera at the moment.
No problem. I did just put you on the spot.
Yeah, we are working on legislation right now to make some adjustments to SLA, although I will say maybe not as broadly as we had hoped. The bill was just introduced. It's AB 2357. The author is Ting. And actually, I think it's about to have some amendments to it published. I'll try and answer some of the specific questions that have come up. The CEQA question is a little complicated. There's nothing in SLA itself, but there's the possibility of using SB 35, which was the streamlining bill that Scott Wiener passed several years ago, that if your jurisdiction isn't meeting its housing element RENA targets, then your project, particularly 100% affordable projects, are likely to qualify for CEQA exemption that way, because the project won't be subject to discretionary review at all. There are some exemptions in CEQA itself for certain kinds of infill affordable housing projects, less than 100 units, less than 5 acres, urbanized area. So it doesn't cover everything, but you may qualify on that basis. But there isn't anything specific that I know of that would exempt a project from CEQA just because it's on public land.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate you jumping in as I just made my colleague be an impromptu panelist before 10 a.m. So I hope you had your coffee, Jeff. Thank you for that. Okay, so we have a couple of other questions that have come through. Can we do anything about Craig Edelman's question, which is, advocacy is critical, but how do we address the different pots of public money that acquires land and find ways to align them with our housing goals? For instance, Caltrans sites that are acquired with federal transportation funds. It's not enough to just say it's public and housing is a public good, right? Yes, Chris, it's definitely, I wish it were as simple as just saying, yeah, well, it's public, so do the right thing. I don't know that I'm answering this specifically, but I will talk a little bit about, when we did the polls in the beginning, many people noted that actually getting financing, actually getting the money to build on these sites, on any sites, but certainly on public land sites, is one of the biggest barriers. And one of the attendees asked earlier, well, we're still competing with people who can bid higher, people who can bid market rate. So the money is a key question. And I guess I would just say a couple things on that. One is that we're always looking at, and I know in Oakland, the city council is always looking at what are different state and federal grants that are out there that we can mobilize, infill infrastructure grants. What else is sort of like not as obvious that we can go and mobilize for these things? What can we get the cities to do? And it's tricky. There's a very live debate. We're working right now with the city of Oakland. We've been working for the past 5 years to get them to pass an across-the-board citywide policy governing how they dispose of city-owned land, taking the Surplus Land Act, which they didn't always used to adhere to, including for that, that East 12 parcel on the lake that I pointed out at the beginning. I will say, if there are any Oakland City staff on the call, the city has gotten much better about adhering to SLA. They're doing it now, but the SLA doesn't say anything about community process. It doesn't say anything about there's a lot of things that it doesn't cover, and we're trying to get a citywide policy in place to have some consistency in community engagement and standards. And what we're hearing from folks in the affordable housing community is that's all well and good, but we don't want a bunch of vacant land that we can't build on because we can't finance the sites. And that's 100% true. And we need to be doing everything we can to renew bonds, to look for new sources from the state. I would also say, though, you've heard the timescale of these projects. We are in this for the long game. And I truly believe that we should not discount public land as a strategy in the short term because we can't figure out how to finance it in the short term. So we need to be doing some land banking. We need to be getting really creative. We need to be urging our city. And I think some of it is a shift in the city mindset from seeing public land as something that is a generator of revenue for that jurisdiction. Like, we just need to sell this land so we can get revenue to do other things. There may be some times where that's appropriate, but what we're trying to do is do a shift in mindset and the housing crisis is urgent, but what's built on land lasts for a really long time. The land is always there. So let's not use a short-term fiscal crisis as a reason to sell off these community assets. We got to figure out the financing puzzle, but we got to do it because it's just too important. So that didn't really answer Craig's question at all, but I just had to say all of that. Does anyone else have anything to say about the question of financing on public sources?
Yeah,
Chris?
I mean, I think just maybe a little bit different perspective than Gloria's perspective here. I mean, I think it is real. There's real issues in our cities and our schools around public finance, and really, I think this is just another example of like why it's so critical for housers in particular. Well, really housers, labor, for all of us to really be thinking about, how do we solve our larger revenue issues as a state, as cities, as neighborhoods. Unless we're able to do things like thinking about, like Prop 15 in past years, that we're going to continue to have these challenges where our local governments are continuing to, have to balance these challenges of how do they address affordable housing needs and the housing crisis, and the very real challenge of revenue gaps in terms of being able to continue to provide essential services or to give our students the educations they need. And so until we can solve those bigger challenges, there's going to be that struggle, but we're going to have to figure out where's the right place to navigate that struggle when it comes to the disposition of public lands.
Yeah, and I would just say, to kind of address Craig's question, whether it's a Caltrans site, it's going to be built in a local municipality. So I think the partnerships with your local city, wherever you're working, those are key. And, I can tell you my experience with the city of Oakland, they're a great partner. They are a fierce partner, right? And, our Councilmember Gallo, is like, his number one thing is in public land, there has to be a public benefit. And that's usually around housing, right? Housing, job creation, whatever. So I just know how the committee is, but it's also the team, the staff at the city of Oakland. We're in it for the long haul. I always say that we've been, married to them for like 50 years. So it's like a 50-year marriage, right? So you have some people you like, some people you don't like in the family, but you got to work together, right? Because it's all about taking care of the community. And I think, when you think about the financing these projects, how you put these deals together, you need them as thought partners, you need them as legal partners, and they could really help kind of move these projects along, but they are partnerships. And I think the partnerships with, and I'll just say, like, the city of Oakland has been a very strong one for us. It's a very positive one. Not always perfect, but we're trying to do the same thing, right? And especially around affordable housing, you need those partnerships. Kind of getting back to what Regina is, so you can start putting these capital stacks together, local money. You have a mayor that put the bond issues out there for the infrastructure. The county put a big bond out. So you have to be able to kind of leverage all these different sources of funding, and then with the state to make these deals work. But I think that the partnerships with your local municipality are really key, and I think something that folks need to really put a lot of time and effort, because I think that's what really helps move these things along.
Thanks so much, Chris. And I'm actually going to stick with you for a minute for another question that's in the Q&A. And I would think this certainly applies for places other than publicly owned land. But do you find that certain building requirements like parking minimums, setback requirements, et cetera, affect the affordability of the project? So that's one question. And then Regina Davis also wants to know if there's anything you can share about your costs and sources. So anything to say on those questions?
Yeah, I mean, parking, parking's a big one because we're building at TOD, right? And TOD, transit development, we want the less and less parking, but people still love their cars, and BART, I think it's a balancing act with BART about, what are the minimum parking requirements and everything. I think now they're down to 0, but that's always a challenge, kind of balancing is out how much space a parking garage takes, whereas, you can put more units in there. So that's always, I think, a challenge, but one that could be worked through. As far as the sources, I know I saw Regina's, I don't have the capital steps offhand, but I think, when you look at, let's say phase 2B, the one that we're dealing right now, it's probably 140, and this is a partnership with Bridge Housing, it's probably maybe 142 million total development cost. The construction loan is 90 million, JP Morgan Chase. But then when you look at 6 million from the city, 20 million from the county, 30 million from the Strategic Growth Council, which goes both to housing and then also the local infrastructure and the BART. So you start adding up all these sources, and then next thing you know, these things are very, very expensive. And as far as cost, per unit, I think many people are looking at that. They're expensive. Each unit is what, 600,000 plus, and I'm being very modest probably on that, right now. So yeah, these are very expensive developments, but they're also, again, partnerships with all of our community, including labor, right? But I can give Regina more detail budgets if she needs to see it for sure.
You're not just gonna like throw your pro forma up on the
Yeah, I
screen
know.
right now? Oh,
If I had
okay.
it, I would.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and also just a continued argument for the affordability actually is, that if we're trying to really encourage transit-oriented development and climate-friendly development, we have got to be flexible with these things, like how much parking is required, and we need to build affordable housing. And it's not that, as you said, it's not that low-income people don't drive cars; they absolutely do. But studies have shown that it's more powerful in terms of reducing greenhouse gases and trips if you're building affordable housing near those sites. And I'm just going to throw this picture up here again real quick. I showed this towards the beginning. This is part of the MacArthur BART Transit Village in Oakland, just about a quarter mile from my house. Unfortunately, this picture, you can't see the affordable housing, which is behind this larger building. What you see in the lower right-hand corner where you see the little BART logo, that's the replacement BART garage that had to be built as part of the project. And that could have been probably a whole other property right there. I'm not trying to criticize this project. It's amazing and transformative, and the whole thing just used to be one giant surface level parking lot, and now it's multiple mid-rise and one high-rise building, including one that's 100% affordable. But it's really thinking about, well, what first of all, what had to be done differently to allow this level of density to be built on this major transit hub, and secondly, what could have been done even more differently to utilize the land. And I should say that all of these properties too, of course, are built on typical mixed use zoning principles. So they all have, except for the affordable property, which is by Bridge, they all have massive amounts of commercial space on the first floor, which is beautiful and 100%, pretty much 100% vacant. And in fairness, these buildings mostly opened during the pandemic, but still it's like vast seas of empty commercial space. Can we do things differently? Okay, so a couple more, I'm gonna do one or two more questions and then have our panelists have a chance to do some wrap up remarks. One great question: many rural areas cannot attract residential development like urban areas, make it difficult for local agencies to require developers to set aside a percentage of affordable units despite a high need. Have you heard of this issue from jurisdictions? Do you have recommendations for addressing this challenge? And I'll see if our panelists have anything to say on this. I will just say, so to be clear, the work, even in Oakland, certainly not a rural place, we are not saying that every public site has to be developed as affordable housing necessarily, but we are saying that the community does need to have some say and some buy-in into what's built there. Sometimes that's affordable, sometimes that's mixed use. So just to be clear, that's not always the goal. There are times where it might be appropriate to do something else with the land, and that might be true in rural areas as well. But does anyone have any input on this one? How do we get local agencies to convince folks that this is a good use?
I'll say that, well, I haven't worked in rural areas myself, so I understand this must be a really difficult challenge, but I don't know all the particulars. Um, Regardless, the Surplus Land Act will probably still apply if it's the agency itself selling or leasing the land and none of the exemptions apply. In which case, even if they can't reach if they don't get a proposal or if they can't reach a deal with an affordable developer for 25% affordable, then still that 15% affordable baseline applies if 10 or more units are built there. So I'm not sure if you work for an agency or an advocate or a houser, but either way, I think it's helpful to know that so that you can at least try to see if that 15% is doable, because it is required.
That's really important, just like, and why it's so important to know this law. Say, hey, this is actually a requirement. You can't get around it. Our last question in the Q&A, how can we encourage cities and counties to utilize eminent domain to seize underutilized vacant land? That's really key there. We don't want the days of seizing people's homes through eminent domain. Those days are hopefully over. Vacant land. LA County did this somewhat recently on a large site in South LA, Vermont, Manchester. This provides jurisdictions the opportunity to use their sovereign immunity powers and build at scale without a zoning overhaul. Any thoughts on the use of eminent domain to build up that inventory of surplus lands? Interesting one.
Well, I would say that I still think that we're coming out of, basically two pandemics, COVID-19, and then just the civil unrest with George Floyd. And we're seeing all of it here still in East Oakland and Fruitvale. So there is still tremendous urgency around this work. And I think public entities, what I think what's happening now is people are taking their masks off, they're kind of getting back to normal. Oh yeah, everything's great now. Yeah, it is in certain areas, but if you're in an area that's been hit hard by COVID, then public entities need to use their power to keep acting like it's an emergency, which it is, right? And if eminent domain works to acquire properties, vacant properties, to create more affordable housing, they need to do that. They need to streamline their processes. No RFPs, RFQs. They know who to negotiate. They really need to streamline it, because now it's an opportunity to take care of the essential workers who took care of everybody else, for the past 2 years, right? Because a lot of the housing that we're talking about is the essential workers, like what Jeff was just talking about in San Jose and other areas, right? So I still think there's a lot of urgency to this work, and public entities can use their power to kind of use their emergency powers to spur development, move development, maybe streamline things. But that's the opportunity that we have right now. And we have money for the first time. A lot of these folks have money that they didn't have before. And you have somebody a governor who's supportive of this, right? So you kind of have things lined up where you should be able to make things happen now. This is like a moment. And if you can't do it now in this moment, then I don't know. And if you're a publicly elected official and aren't willing to go to bat for this right now, then maybe you should be doing that right now, because this is a moment that you got to take advantage of to move these kind of things and to be creative and bold.
Thanks. Yeah, so true. This is the moment. I'm going to pass it to, we're going to do closing remarks now. I'm going to pass it to Jeffrey first, because he actually has someplace else that he has to hop on to. So Jeffrey, any last words?
No, I just want to say thanks for everyone. This is tremendous to see this many folks engaged in this question. Continue it. It takes partnerships between the community, between labor, between government agencies, developers, to really figure this question out of how do we best use, what's the highest and best use of our public lands, and how do we ensure that we're getting that public good from our public lands. There's no simple prescription, there's no magic bullet. And so really it's going to take engagement from all sectors and the political will to do something different than we've done in the past. And so just deep appreciation for everyone that's still engaging to try to make these things happen. So thank you so much. And for folks who are interested in learning more about the community benefits agreement, feel free to reach out to me, Jeffrey at wpusa.org. So thank you so much for the time.
Thanks, Jeffrey. We know you have to sign off, but appreciate that. All right, let me pass it back to Shajuti. Any last words? How can people take action? What do you want people to leave with today?
Yeah, I want to echo what Chris said earlier about communicating with local agencies early on. And then if you are at a local agency, communicating with affordable housing developers and advocates early on, so you can come up with creative solutions and figure out, okay, what's required of me under the law, and then where can we get creative? I think that early communication is very key.
Absolutely. Chris, any last thoughts to round it out?
No, thank you for pulling this all together. But I think, like I was saying, I think this is a really unique opportunity for all of us. you know, whether you're in city government or you're in government or you're an advocate or a developer, you know, to really, you know, I think big and bold and really go for it right now. Thank you.
Absolutely. If not now, when? All right. Thank you so much to our panelists and to Housing California conference staff for supporting, and to all of you for joining us this morning. Please follow up with us. You can find us all in the Whova app, and we'd love to continue the conversation. Have a great morning, everyone.